Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico, episode 19, Prelude to Revolt. Before we get into today's episode and continue, there's a few things I want to talk about up front. The main thrust of this episode being a little shorter, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about some things that I've been trying to fit in to other episodes and just haven't found a good opportunity to do so. The main thing I want to talk about is the Spanish casta system. While not super important to the history of New Mexico, it still has its place and will occasionally use terms from this system. The casta system has its roots in 1492 with the expulsion of the Moors from Spain. It was one of the first times the Spanish really differentiated themselves from other groups. Prior to the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, to grossly oversimplify, created modern Spain, the peninsula was divided among religious lines. Within that, they were also divided into many petty kingdoms such as Castile and Aragon. After the expulsion in 1492, Spaniards started to think of themselves as distinct from other groups in the area, as Españols, and not as citizens of the Kingdom of Leon or Castile, although some regional loyalty would still persist. Within the casta system was also a religious hierarchy. While Catholicism was the state religion, those who had been compelled to convert, called conversos, being subject to discrimination and accusations of backsliding. Descendants of conversos that came to New Mexico will be talked about in a future episode. When they came to the New World, the Spanish brought these ideas of a racial hierarchy with. These ideas would also mix with a new one, miscegenation, or marriage between people of different races. When the Spanish arrived, they had children with the people from the various tribes they interacted with, or with people of African descent, slave or free. We'll start with those considered non-casta. These would be your peninsular Spaniards, especially those from Castile, your criollos, which were pure-blooded Spaniards born in the New World, and then the rest of your Europeans. People of African descent and Native Americans were also not subject to the casta system. Those that were subject to the casta system were derived from how much Spanish blood they had. Sometimes, instead of the complex nature of the system, would often require an extensive genealogy. A census taker would use a category of color quebrado, or broken color, which would track at a high level what your parents were, usually broken into 6 categories depending on which race each parent belonged to. Some other oddities in the system, especially for New Mexico, is the term genizario. In New Mexico, the term is often used for detribalized Indians. Usually these were people from plains tribes that the Spanish obtained at a young age, using them as servants. Often they'd grow up to be Christian. Sometimes the term is used for quote-unquote civilized Indians that were not a Pueblo group. Sometimes genizarios would establish their own pueblos. Another term, coyote, is used almost interchangeably with mestizo. Both terms do refer to someone of Hispanic and Native American mixed ancestry. Coyote may have also been used to refer to someone who has not quite reached the same status as a mestizo. On the frontier, the casta system was not as strongly enforced as in other parts of New Spain, although no casta would ever become governor or an ordained priest, although they would make their way into various crafts. Overall, the big thing for how it applied to New Mexico is that Españols received better treatment legally compared to other groups. For instance, those caught trading with the Utes were fined 10 pesos, but castas and Native Americans were also given an additional 10 lashes on top of the fine. Overall, the Pueblos also chafed under this system, the encomienda system and the reparimiento system. I don't think we talked about the reparimiento system, but it was basically just a forced labor system. Think encomiendas, but for labor instead. With all that out of the way, let's get into the main meat of this episode. Last time we talked about the brewing conflicts between the Franciscans and the secular government. Today we'll discuss the background and events leading up to the Pueblo Revolt. As we've discussed throughout the early colonial period, for the Pueblos it was a time of intermittent repression of their religious or cultural practices, dividing their communities and forced. Moving into the years before 1680, there would be several more attempted revolts. The most notable of these would be the revolts attempted by Esteban Clemente. Esteban was one of many prominent Pueblo leaders that adopted Spanish ways. He was a leader among the Salinas and Jumano Pueblos. In the 1660s, he would become a Pueblo leader in his own right. By hook or by crook, the Spanish would have him write a denunciation of the Kachina cults. Later in the 1660s, there would be a bad drought, especially among the Salinas Pueblos. This drought did not just affect the Pueblos or colonial settlements, it also hit the Navajos and the Apaches, causing them to begin raiding with greater frequency. Esteban, however, took this as divine retribution for his denunciation of the Kachinas, and that brought him back to practicing his traditional religion. Near the end of the 1660s, another plot for rebellion would be discovered, and 8 leaders among the Pueblos would be hanged. Esteban would swear to avenge these leaders. He planned to enlist the aid of the Apaches and spark a general revolt, such as seen in previous plots against the Spanish. His plan was simple: to move the Spanish horses into the mountains, Then on Maundy Thursday, during that night's service, the Pueblos and Apaches would spring the trap throughout the colony and kill all the Spaniards. The Spanish would find out about this plot and hanged Esteban and quieted the rest. Upon seizing his property and entering his home, they, quote, found in his house a large number of idols and entire kettles full of idolatrous powdered herbs, feathers, and other trifles. Esteban was not the only one plotting to expel the Spanish. At Okeawinge, one Pope was biding his time for the right moment. Another man, Bartolome de Oeda at Santa Ana, was also waiting for the right moment to strike. Pope will become a central figure of the revolt. I'd even go so far as to say the central figure of the revolt. While not a lot is known about him, I want to cover what we do know outside of the revolt itself. He was born in Okeawinge, probably sometime around 1630, making him around 50 at the time of the revolt in 1680. Pope's name roughly translates from tewa to ripe cultigens, although older books tend to use translations like ripe squash. Due to his name, it is likely he belonged to the summer moiety. I didn't really talk about the moieties much, so just as a quick review, among the Pueblos, the moieties were a way to divide leadership. For Okeawinge, you had the summer and winter moieties, which were, rather obviously, in charge in the summer or winter season respectively. These groups were in charge of kind of the whole Pueblo, including its religious rites and organizing things like hunts. Well, it's not exactly clear what his rank within the Pueblos was. Pope is often given the rank of war leader at the time of the revolt. This rank was more of a religious office than a military one, though. Although for the Pueblos at the time, religion and daily life, secular life were all heavily mixed, so it's not a perfect way to say he was solely religious or solely in charge of the military. He wouldn't be leading on the front lines with this rank, though. Outside of what he did, that's about all we know about the man. No physical description of him has surfaced, nor has the date of his death come down. Anyway, moving back to where the narrative, the hard times would not abate during the 1670s. Plague and famine continued to haunt the colony, causing at least some of the Pueblos to long for a return to the traditional religion. Governor Juan Francisco de Trevino would have to put down a return to the Cachinas in 1675. Friars at other Pueblos were complaining about similar issues. During this repressive time, at least 45 men that the Spanish perceived as leading this resurgence, including Pope, would be imprisoned. The final verdict was that 4 of these men were to be hanged across different linguistic. One would be hung at Nambe, San Felipe, and Jemez. The last of the 4 would hang himself in his cell before his sentence could be carried out. The rest were lashed and sentenced to servitude. A group of Tewa came up with a plan to rescue these men. They were going to come bearing gifts, but much more armed than usual. They would then demand pardon and release of all the prisoners or else. They also left an ambush in the hills above Santa Fe, in case their demands weren't honored. More than 70 armed men would end up pushing their way into the governor's quarters, filling 2 full rooms. The governor accepted the gifts and gave his own in kind. He would also try to stall on the demands, saying, quote, "Wait a while, children. I will give them to you and pardon them on condition that you forsake idolatry and iniquity." End quote. Eventually, though, the governor would relent and release the men. Pope would find refuge far to the north in Taos Pueblo. Meanwhile, the Spanish needed a royal grant to sustain the colony. Fray Francisco de Ayeta had been dispatched to beg for this grant. The Archbishop of Mexico heard this plea first and agreed that 50 soldiers, mostly convicts, should be sent to the colony at the crown's expense. On the way north with weapons, supplies, and these reinforcements, several of these prisoners-turned-soldiers would desert, taking some of the supplies with them. In 1677, Governor Trevino prepared to transfer his authority to Governor Antonio de Oterman, most likely also warning his successor about the events with the Tewas. He would also probably inform the incoming governor as to who would have a history with the Tewas, including one Francisco Javier, who would later become a lightning rod for dissent. Ayeta would continue back into Mexico City in 1678, seeking more supplies. His argument basically boils down to the following. There were 46 pueblos with about 17,000 people, 6,000 of which were fighting age, and didn't necessarily like the Spanish. He also estimated some 170 Spaniards were capable of fighting. He was trying to argue that they needed more supplies of men in case these 6,000 people tried to throw the Spanish. Ayeta's request was forwarded to Madrid without recommendation. This was a common delaying tactic throughout the Spanish Empire, when they didn't want to make a decision. The Council of the Indies sent back that they should assess the cost and need of the project. At this point, it was 1680. Up to this time, Pope had been planning the revolt and gathering supporters from across the Pueblo. Unlike previous revolts that may have only included some groups, the new plan was a complete revolt of the Pueblos to expel all the Spaniards. Not all of the Pueblos immediately supported the rebellion, but due to the actions of those like Francisco Javier, most would fall in line. For instance, those in Pecos, who you might remember had become so divided that some had begun to leave the main Pueblo and build their own dwellings near the church, may not have been all for revolt. However, Francisco Javier would come to a trade fair between the Pueblo and the Apache. Under a banner of peace, he approached, before revealing his true plan, to capture the whole Apache camp and take them prisoner. Events like this could have pushed many at Pecos to support revolt, since around this time word of the plan would reach Pecos. Even then, not everyone was in agreement. One Juan de Ye from Pecos would inform the Spanish of the brewing rebellion. But the plan was familiar: steal the Spanish horses and kill them all during a religious service. To facilitate this event, runners were sent out with deerskin thongs to each of the pueblos. Several knots were tied on this thong to signify the days of the rebellion. When the knots ran out, it was to be the day of revolution, which was planned for early August that year. With that, I will leave it here for a time with rebellion right on the horizon. Into early November, when we will get back to the main narrative, I want to spend the month of October doing a handful of special episodes. I'm planning at least 2, but depending on how long they end up being, it may be as many as 4. The first one coming out in the first week of October, I'll have a better idea of how many episodes these special episodes will be. But since it's October, I figure it's a good time to talk about some of the more supernatural. Like I said, there'll be a short break and then we'll be back to the main narrative.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.